I think this, you might think that, and so on. And then finally, the usual form that we see is a third-person point of view, where the narrator of the piece is not also a character in the piece. And again, the typical position for a third-person point of view is what's known as an omniscient narrator. Omniscient narrators know what's going on inside the heads of all of the characters in the novel, not just the protagonist. And when the narration turns from one character to another, we move from one character's mind to another. There is also what literary scholars call the limited third-person perspective, where the narrator knows what's going on in one or more characters in the novel, but not in everybody's mind. And then finally, characteristic of much 20th and 21st century fiction is what's known as the unreliable narrator, where the narrator is not omniscient. The narrator is making inferences, perhaps, about what's going on in the minds of various characters, but those inferences might be mistaken. So this is the kind of thing that Kate Hudson is writing her PhD dissertation about, and this is the kind of thing that she's talking about when she talks about how consciousness lies at the center of the literary enterprise. Put another way, what this literary work is all about is the problem of intersubjectivity. Now, we talked earlier in the course about subjectivity being an essential property of consciousness. That is, the idea that we experience ourselves as having various kinds of mental states, thoughts and feelings and desires and the like. But we also, as we move around the world and as we write and read pieces of fiction, we engage in intersubjectivity, which is to say we try to understand, make inferences about the mental states of other people, whether they're the other people we're dealing with in the ordinary course of everyday living, or the other people in some kind of character. So the simplest form that this intersubjectivity takes is the perception by one person of the internal mental states of some other person. I can say, I'm happy, or I want to be alone, or whatever, and that's my introspections about myself. Or I can say that she is outgoing, or wants to be happy, or wants to be alone, in which case I'm talking about something closer to a perception or an inference, some kind of knowledge about another person's mental state. So we've got this essential distinction, which comes to us actually from a sociologist named Alfred Schutz, between subjective mental states and then this intersubjectivity when we're trying to understand somebody else. But it turns out that intersubjectivity is itself a little bit complicated. Remember that what intersubjectivity really is about is what the philosophers call intentionality. And again, we talked about this at the beginning of the semester. Philosophers tend to use this term intentionality quite differently than ordinary people on the street do. There's this motivational sense of intentionality. I intend to come to class today. I intend to give a lecture. I intend not to get wet. I intend not to have a tree fall on me as I'm driving home. Or there's this epistemic sense of intentionality, which has to do with knowledge on the fact that our mental states are about something else. So in this epistemic sense, our mental states are broadly represented as beliefs about the world, and intersubjectivity represents our beliefs about somebody else's belief. Again, trying to get inside somebody's head, trying to understand what this other person is conscious of. This gets even more complicated because it turns out that there are different levels of intentionality. There are different levels of intersubjectivity. So, for example, at the first order, I can say, I can see that it's raining outside. That's something that I can perceive. It's something that I'm conscious of. At the second level, somebody else has a belief about what my belief is. So Lucy believes, or Lucy knows that I see that it's raining. You can carry this out to the third order, where there's now a third character here who believes something about what a second person believes about what a first person believes. And then you can do fourth order intentionality. You can actually do a lot more than this, as you'll see in a second, where, for example, Stan forgot that Judy believes that Lucy knows that I see that it's raining. One person's belief about another person's belief about another person's belief. So we got what Robin Dunbar, who's a literarily oriented a cognitive scientist, talks about different levels of intentionality represented by a set of statements like this. Jane believes that Peter supposes that Sarah thinks that Simon believes that Sarah would like to go out with Peter. Okay? So Sarah would like to go out with Peter. That's a representation of Sarah's mental state, and everything else here are representations of other people's beliefs or other people's mental states about Sarah. It turns out you can even have different levels of intentionality that don't involve more than two people. Here's a New Yorker cartoon, one of my favorite recent New Yorker cartoons. Of course I care about how you imagined, I thought you perceived, I wanted you to feel. Okay? Now, if you count them up, you've got about a half a dozen different levels of intentionality there, but only two individuals. And again, this is the kind of thing that crops up in literary and humanistic treatments of consciousness as well. The person who's made this point most clearly within the arts and humanities, if it wasn't Lodge himself, is an English literature scholar at the University of Kentucky named Lisa Zunshine, whose work, if you're really interested in literature, I would encourage you to take a look at her work, who's made a living pointing out, really, that this idea of intersubjectivity, of one person knowing or believing what another person is knowing or believing, but plays a major role in at least the English novel. That's what she's an expert on. But Zunshine has actually argued that that intersubjectivity in the novel is really a relatively recent invention and was essentially the invention of one person, Jane Austen. And when you read the works of Jane Austen, or if you go to a Jane Austen movie or watch them on Masterpiece Theater or whatever, you'll see immediately, if you're paying attention, not just swilling popcorn and Coke or whatever, you'll see that a lot of the plot turns around what people know or believe about what other people believe, and so on. Now, with Austen, we usually get only two or three levels of intentionality. But Zunshine points out that modern literature, that is, literature of the 20th century, 21st century, the work of Virginia Woolf, for example, or the work of Don DeLillo, can require a reader to keep track of maybe 6 or 7 different levels of intentionality, which is one of the things that makes the reading of many of these models something that's very complicated. Why? Because, think about this number here. What's the big number in psychology? The magical number 7 plus or minus 2. It's very hard to keep more than about a half a dozen things in your head. The magical number is actually probably closer to 4 or 5 items. That's the capacity of working memory. So that one of the things that makes the modern novel so difficult for people to read, so challenging, and for that matter, so interesting, is that it forces the reader to keep track of 6 or 7 levels of intentionality, 6 or 7 levels of consciousness at the time. Here's a nice example. This is from Zunshine herself, from Persuasion. There's an episode in Persuasion where Anne and Elizabeth go shopping in town, and they meet Wentworth, who used to be connected to Elizabeth. And what happens here is that Elizabeth sees Wentworth, and Wentworth knows that Elizabeth has seen him, but she doesn't want to interact with Wentworth, so she pretends that she hasn't seen him, and there's Anne here who knows what Elizabeth has done, that has seen, knows what Elizabeth believes, and knows what Wentworth believes, and is trying to get out of the situation. So he was ready to be acknowledged as an acquaintance. He was expecting it, and she had the pain of seeing her sister turn away with unalterable coldness. This is exactly the kind of third-person description of consciousness that Kate Hudson is talking about in her arguments with Ralph Messenger. Now, this idea of intersubjectivity is essentially the invention of Jane Austen, if Sunshine is right. But there are various kinds of anticipations of it. So, for example, if you think about Shakespeare's play Othello, the whole plot of Othello hinges on this kind of multi-level subjectivity. So that, again, this is an example from Robin Dunbar. Shakespeare, when he wrote the play Othello, wanted the audience who's viewing the play to understand that Iago intended, that Othello believed, that Desdemona loved somebody else. So here you've got Desdemona's mental state, one place, Othello's belief about Desdemona, Iago's intentions toward those beliefs, and so on. Nice set of actually 5 levels of intentionality in Othello. You see the same kind of thing in the Odyssey, as I pointed out last time. There are lots of episodes in the Odyssey where the episode itself hinges on Odysseus's ideas about what somebody else will think. So, for example, Polyphemus, the Cyclops, has just one eye. Odysseus and his men blind him. That's what's going on in this depiction on this Greek vase here. And then later, Odysseus has his men cling to the undersides of sheep, of Polyphemus's sheep, in order to escape from the Cyclops' cage. And Odysseus knows that Polyphemus, being blind, is only going to be able to stroke the tops of his sheep to make sure that Odysseus' men are not riding outside the cage and not thinking that they could cling to the bottoms of them. So again, Odysseus knew that when Polyphemus was blinded, he would not be able to see his men escaping underneath his sheep. So you can see this kind of thing in various ways. Here's another one from the story in Genesis of Jacob and Esau, where basically Jacob tricks Isaac into giving him his blessing, and the whole episode in Genesis boils down to what Rebekah, Isaac's wife, knew about how Jacob could trick Isaac into believing that he, Jacob, was Esau. It's a lovely, actually, I think it's the earliest known reference to the false belief test, because that's really what it is. At another level, the different kind of literary form, there are lots of examples of modern literature, 20th century, 21st century literature, where problems of consciousness come to the fore. The clearest example here is James Joyce's Ulysses, which in its concluding chapter, actually Ulysses is kind of structured along the lines of the Odyssey, but the entire